The bitter winter wind blew with relentless violence, making the trees stripped of their leaves look like haunted figures, bowing submissively to the force of the storm. Ethan was standing at the edge of the cliff, his feet sinking into the snow that continued to accumulate around him, but he barely felt the cold. The immensity of the mountain stretched out before him, imposing and unattainable, just like the answers he was searching for. The muffled sound of falling snow contrasted with the whirlwind of thoughts running through his mind. Weeks had passed since Claire disappeared in that avalanche. Deep down, Ethan knew that there was no more hope, that no one would survive that long in the middle of that white hell. But accepting this reality was an open wound, and he refused to let it heal. There were no goodbyes, there was no last look, just the sudden, cruel wall of snow that swallowed her forever, without warning, without forgiveness. He repeated that scene in his head over and over again. The minutes before the tragedy were burned into his memory, each detail more vivid than the last. Claire's laugh, so vibrant and full of life, echoed like a ghost. She had taken off her cap for a moment, shaking her black hair and letting the biting cold of the mountain kiss her face. "This is the best place in the world," she said with that radiant smile that lit up everything around her. A smile that now only existed in Ethan's memories. As Ethan watched the snow-covered valley, a suffocating sense of guilt took root deeper and deeper into his heart. He should have done something different. I could have stopped Claire from climbing the mountain that day. I could have chosen another path. I could have been more insistent on the warnings about the approaching storm. But the grim truth was that he had failed. Her absence weighed on him like the ice that covered the ground. Every second that passed without her felt like an eternity of torture. On that fateful night, as they prepared for the climb, the weather still seemed stable. Claire was excited, as always, eager to conquer another one of the great mountains that the two of them had promised to climb together. "We are unstoppable," she had said, full of energy and conviction. But fate had been merciless. In a matter of minutes, the sky collapsed on top of them. The storm arrived like a hungry predator, taking the group of climbers by surprise. Before they could react, an avalanche descended with the force of 1,000 thunderclaps, sweeping away everything in its path. Ethan was thrown to the side, miraculously survived, but Claire was swallowed by the snow, leaving no trace. Now, he was alone, trapped in an unbearable internal struggle between accepting the emptiness left by the loss and the insatiable desire to find her, to bring her back, even if it was just for one last goodbye. Every step he took on that mountain brought him closer to the abyss, both physical and emotional. The vast white desert around him was not only the scene of his pain, but also the mirror of his own devastated soul. As the snow began to fall again, slowly and silently, Ethan heard a distant sound, a barely perceptible noise that brought him out of his dark thoughts. Was it just the echo of the wind between the frozen trees, or something else? Ethan's heart sped up, even though he knew it was impossible. An irrational hope grew inside him, like a flame that refused to go out. What if Claire was there, somewhere, waiting to be rescued? This possibility, however absurd it was, drove him to continue. The gray sky seemed to press in on Ethan from all sides. Every step he took in the deep snow was a constant reminder of his failure. The physical pain he felt in his legs from the effort of climbing was nothing compared to the invisible burden he carried on his shoulders. It was as if he was trying to climb a mountain inside himself, a mountain made up of guilt and regret and longing for Claire. With each new memory, his heart hurt more. He remembered the promises they had made to each other, the shared dream of exploring the world together, of conquering the highest mountains, of living intensely. But now, all those promises seemed empty, swallowed up by the snow and the deadly silence of that mountain. Ethan didn't know how to move forward. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Claire's face, heard her crystal-clear laugh, and the world around him became a blur of pain. He clearly remembered the moment everything changed. When the avalanche descended with the fury of nature, he still held her hand. The contact was brief, almost insignificant, but that moment was recorded in his mind. It was as if the mountain had ripped Claire from his arms, as if it had decided, in a single second, that he would live and she would not. The helplessness he felt at that moment was indescribable. There was no force that could fight the mountain. There was no way to rescue Claire from the fate that awaited her. Ethan fell to his knees in the snow, his body exhausted and his spirit broken. He had climbed this far not because he truly believed he would find Claire, but because he didn't know what else to do. The world without her seemed meaningless, a cold, empty expanse, just like the land around her. He pressed his fists into the snow, feeling the ice burning his hands, trying desperately to feel something other than the internal pain that consumed him. In a moment of desperation, he screamed. He screamed into the void, into the mountain, into Claire, into the universe. His scream echoed among the distant peaks, a sound filled with pain, anger, and deep sadness. But the echo that returned was as empty as the silence before. Nothing has changed. The mountain remained impassive, indifferent to the human pain unfolding at its base. Ethan was alone, truly alone, and it crushed him inside. He knew he couldn't go on like this, but he also didn't know how to stop. The despair of no longer having Claire by his side was unbearable. As if continuing his walk towards an unknown destination, he began to wonder if that mountain would also be his end. Maybe, as he made his way to the top, he would find something that would bring meaning to his pain. Perhaps, in the vastness of the void, he could find the peace, or at least the understanding he so sought. As he advanced, his thoughts sank deeper into darkness. He began to question his own life, his choices, everything that had led him to that moment. Every memory of Claire felt like a knife cutting into her soul. The happy moments they shared now brought more pain than comfort, as if the weight of longing increased with each step taken. Ethan was lost, not just on the mountain, but within himself. Then, suddenly, something unexpected took him out of his thoughts. A sound that didn't come from wind or snow. It was soft, distant, but clearly distinct. Ethan stopped immediately, his senses heightened by adrenaline. Would it be possible? Could it be another hallucination caused by despair? He didn't know, but something inside him, an almost primitive instinct, impelled him to follow that sound, ignoring the tiredness and pain. His heart was beating fast, and hope, that same hope that he had been trying to suppress for weeks, began to rise again, against his will. Ethan forced himself forward, each step heavier than the last, each breath more labored due to the altitude. He couldn't allow despair to paralyze him now, not after so much suffering. The distant sound still echoed in Ethan's ears as he trudged through the snow. Each step felt like a monumental challenge, as if the ground itself wanted to swallow him. But something inside him, an inexplicable desire to continue, pushed him forward. What had he heard? Was it just the wind, playing with his fragile mind? Or, perhaps, some trace of life beyond that infinite solitude? The cold had long ago invaded his bones, becoming part of who he was at that moment. The feeling of numbness wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He was trapped, living in a reality where everything he knew had been swallowed up by the avalanche. Yet something about that sound, that little breath of life, awakened a new energy within Ethan, a spark of hope he didn't even know existed yet. With his hands shaking from the cold, he adjusted the backpack on his back, feeling the weight of the responsibility he still carried. He remembered what Claire always said about mountains. They are more than physical challenges, she often stated. They are a reflection of who we are inside. Each climb reveals something new about ourselves. Ethan had never fully understood those words until now. Every step he took was not just a struggle against the treacherous terrain. It was an internal battle. He wasn't just looking for Claire. He was trying to find himself again amid the chaos of his grief. The sound returned, this time clearer. His heart raced. It was real. Something, or someone, was there. The urge to run took over his body, but he knew he needed to control this urge. If it was a hallucination, giving in to the emotion would only lead to exhaustion. But what if it wasn't? And if? He looked around, trying to identify where the sound was coming from. Everything looked the same. The infinite white of the snow, the frozen rocks. Then, in the distance, a shadow moved. His eyes, tired and unfocused, struggled to adjust their focus. Could it be an animal, perhaps, or a person. He wanted to believe that it was Claire, that she had somehow survived, that she was there, waiting to be rescued. The mix of fear and hope made him hesitate. What if it was real? What if he found her? Was he ready for this? It had been weeks since the Avalanche destroyed their lives, and in all that time, he had imagined thousands of scenarios. Some were tragically final, where he found himself burying the only person he loved. Others were full of hope, where Claire emerged from the snow, miraculously alive, laughing as always. But now, faced with the possibility of finding something or someone, Ethan felt the weight of fear mix with hope. The pain that had accompanied him there suddenly intensified. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. His hands were shaking, not just because of the cold, but because of the possibility of facing the truth, whatever it was. Driven by urgency and mixed emotions, Ethan began walking toward the moving shadow. His feet sank deep into the snow, and each step was a struggle against physical and emotional resistance. He didn't know if he was heading towards salvation or destruction, but he could no longer stand still, trapped in despair. Whatever was there, he needed to find out. As he got closer, his eyes began to make out a figure more clearly. It was a person. Shock ran through his body. "Claire," he murmured, his voice barely audible on the wind. What he saw was not Claire's vibrant smile, nor the happy, lively body he knew. What he found was a reflection of his own pain. The figure before him was hunched over, fighting the cold, barely able to move. Ethan ran the last few meters between them, his lungs burning from the effort. When he got close enough, he could see the person's face, and it wasn't Claire. Relief and disappointment mixed together in an almost suffocating way. It was a young woman, another climber who, like him, had been caught off guard by the mountain's fury. His eyes were filled with terror, his skin pale, almost blue from the extreme cold. He caught her before she fell into the snow. Her eyes met his, and for a brief second, everything around her disappeared. There, in the midst of the desolation, they shared a silent understanding. Both were survivors, both had lost something, or someone. But at that moment, they needed each other to continue. Ethan held the young woman tightly, feeling the weight of her exhaustion in his arms. She was shaking uncontrollably, her eyes wide and lost, not saying a word. He knew that the cold had already begun to take over his body, and time was against them. Her hands, frozen and purple, barely moved. He needed to act quickly. "Are you well? Listen to me." His voice was hoarse, barely audible against the sound of the wind. There was no immediate response, but a small nod made him realize she still had some consciousness. Even so, her gaze was distant, as if she was clinging to the last thread of sanity. Ethan knew their survival depended on finding shelter soon. The approaching storm was increasingly intense, and continuing in those conditions would be a fatal risk. Looking around, he saw a small space between the rocks, partially covered by snow. It would be tight, but perhaps it would protect them from the wind and provide some warmth. "Come on, we have to get out of here." "I'll help you," Ethan said, his voice firmer now, as he carefully lifted her, feeling her body practically drained of strength. The young woman stumbled but held on to him as they both struggled through the rapidly accumulating snow. With each step, Ethan felt the cold biting his skin, but the urgency to save that life, and perhaps his own, kept him moving. His thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and doubt. What if they couldn't get to the shelter in time? What if she didn't survive? Another life lost to that mountain? He couldn't bear to bear any more guilt. Finally, they reached the space between the rocks. Ethan pushed snow with his freezing hands to widen the entrance and, with effort, managed to fit them into the narrow interior. The wind was still howling outside, but inside the makeshift shelter, there was a modicum of protection. They were far from safe, but at least they had a chance. Ethan hugged the young girl, trying to share some warmth. She was unconscious now, her eyes closed, but her breathing, although weak, was still present. Desperation was beginning to grow within him. He didn't know her name, he didn't know her story, but at that moment, her life was his responsibility. As time passed, Ethan began to talk, more to himself than to the young woman, trying to shake off the feeling of isolation. "You're going to be fine. I promise. I don't know how, but we're going to get out of this." The words echoed in the cramped space, but they sounded hollow, almost like an apology. The hours passed slowly. Ethan stayed awake, forcing himself to watch every small change in the young woman's breathing, praying she wouldn't stop breathing. He didn't know how to deal with that situation. The mountain had tested all his limits, both physical and emotional. Every moment was a struggle between hope and resignation. Over the course of the night, Ethan began to remember Claire again. His exhausted mind fluttered between memories. He could almost feel her presence at his side, like so many times before, on the adventures they had together. But now, that absence was an emptiness that consumed his soul. He whispered her name without realizing it, as if, somehow, Claire could hear him and bring him some comfort. Suddenly, the young woman moved her head, moaning softly. Ethan came back to reality with a start. She was waking up. Hope began to throb in his chest again. Hey, it's okay. You are safe now." He didn't know if his words were true, but he wanted to believe them. The young girl opened her eyes, still confused. But this time her lips moved, forming a faint sound. "My name is Lucy." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to break the oppressive silence that hung over them. Ethan smiled slightly, relieved to know she was still there, still fighting. "I'm Ethan. Let's get out of this, Lucy. Together." In that moment, despite the cold, fear, and uncertainty, a small spark of human connection ignited. They were no longer alone. Intense cold still dominated the small makeshift shelter, but something in Lucy's eyes awakened a feeling in Ethan that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if, in that moment of shared fragility, they had both found a reason to keep fighting. Ethan could feel life slowly returning to Lucy's body, but he also knew that time was against them. The wind was blowing mercilessly outside, and they needed to move before it was too late. Lucy looked at Ethan, her eyes still filled with fear, but also with a strange determination. "How long? Do you think we can stay here?" Her voice was weak, but there was a thread of urgency in it that Ethan recognized well. The same urgency he felt when he realized Claire was lost. "Not a lot. The cold will end up killing us if we stay still. But if we wait a little, maybe the wind will die down, and we can try to find somewhere safer," he replied, forcing a calmness he didn't feel. Every second that passed was a struggle to keep hope alive, to not give in to the despair that crept into his mind. Lucy nodded, wrapping her arms around herself to try and keep warm. "Were you with someone?" The question came out hesitantly, but there was a painful understanding in her eyes. Ethan knew she recognized that kind of loss. It was something that transcended words, a pain that only those who had faced it knew. For a moment, Ethan was silent. Claire's name floated through his mind, as present as the blizzard outside. It was difficult to talk about her, as if every mention was a definitive confirmation of her absence. "Yes, Claire. She was with me. We got caught in the avalanche and I lost her." The words came out choppy, carrying a crushing weight. Even now, guilt suffocated him. He had lost Claire, and that loss followed him like a shadow, with every step, with every breath. Lucy, still shivering from the cold, reached out and lightly touched Ethan's arm. "Me too. I lost someone. My brother. He was right behind me on the way up, and then it all came crashing down." Tears began to stream down Lucy's eyes, freezing on her face before they could reach her chin. Ethan's heart sank when he heard those words. He knew that pain so deeply that, for a moment, he didn't know what to say. There was no consolation, no words capable of softening the loss. He simply held Lucy's hand firmly, as if that silent gesture was enough to create a bridge between the two, a bridge made of shared suffering. The two remained silent for some time, listening only to the howl of the wind outside. The despair, although present, began to be replaced by an eerie stillness. They knew they were at the end of their tether, but somehow, each other's presence offered a small emotional refuge. At that moment, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Perhaps, until then, he had only fought to survive for Claire. Now, with Lucy by his side, there was a new reason, a new person to protect. The wind finally began to die down. Ethan knew it was time to try to move on. They had no other choice. If they stayed there much longer, the cold would overcome them, no matter how hard they fought. "We need to get out of here, Lucy. I'll help you up, and we'll move together, slowly." Lucy, despite being weak, nodded. There was a strength in his eyes that seemed hidden before, a quiet determination. Ethan pulled her up, feeling her body still trembling and fragile. They slowly emerged from the shelter, feeling the wind cut their faces like small blades of ice. But now, they were no longer alone. There was something stronger than the cold that drove them. Crossing the snow was like fighting an invisible force, each step draining what little energy I had left. Lucy's feet slipped frequently, but Ethan was there, steady by her side, pulling her back up each time she fell. And with each stumble, with each heavy breath, the connection between them grew. It wasn't just the cold that brought them together, but the pain of their losses, the silent despair of someone who had already seen the worst of life. After some time, they saw a larger rock formation. Maybe there was more shelter there, something that could give them a chance of survival. Ethan's heart quickened with renewed hope. "See that? We'll get there." Lucy's eyes narrowed, trying to see what Ethan was pointing out. She nodded, although exhaustion was evident in every line of her face. They continued walking, now with a new objective, a new goal to reach. The path was still uncertain, but the simple act of continuing to move was a victory. With each step towards the rock formation, the world around him seemed to become more hostile. The wind had died down, but the cold was still relentless, and the snow beneath his feet was like an endless white ocean. Lucy struggled to keep her balance, and Ethan knew she was at the end of her tether. Even he, who felt his own body rebelling against fatigue, could not ignore the fact that they were in a race against time. The rock formation was finally within reach, and when they reached the base, Ethan felt a wave of relief. It wasn't the perfect refuge, but it was much better than being exposed to the freezing wind that continued to whistle in the distance. They approached a ledge, where they could at least protect themselves from the more violent currents. "Can you sit down?" asked Ethan, helping Lucy into the narrow space. She nodded, although her face showed an overwhelming tiredness. "This is better," she murmured, her voice barely carrying itself. Her face was pale, and her eyes were glassy, almost absent. Ethan looked around, looking for something, anything, he could use to warm them up or protect them better. But there, all there was rock and snow, the implacable silence of the mountain. He looked at Lucy, who was becoming quieter and quieter, her breathing becoming more and more irregular. His heart sank. He knew that if they didn't find help soon, she wouldn't last long. "I need to do something," he whispered to himself, despair beginning to overwhelm him. Sitting next to Lucy, Ethan tried to process everything that had happened since the avalanche. Claire had disappeared. He had lost sight of her in that whirlwind of snow, and now he was here, trying to save a stranger. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was reliving that day. A bitter déjà vu that forced him to confront his greatest fears. Lucy suddenly moved slightly, pulling on Ethan's arm. Her eyes, now weaker, focused on him for a moment. "Ethan," she murmured, as if she had something important to say, but her voice wavered. He held her hand tightly, trying to convey some reassurance. "I'm here, Lucy. Stay with me, please." What could he do? Every second that passed felt like a blow to his resolve. He was torn between staying by her side or trying to get help. But if he left her, and something happened while he was away? What if, when he sought help, he was also unable to return? Lucy tightened her grip on Ethan's hand, interrupting his thoughts. Do you think she's still there? Claire?" The question came like a knife, piercing his chest. It was the first time Lucy had mentioned Claire since learning her story. Ethan blinked, his gaze getting lost in the white expanse ahead. "I don't know," he replied, honestly. "I want to believe so. But at the same time, every day that passes makes it more difficult." The pain in his voice was palpable. Admitting it out loud was like accepting the truth he had fought so hard to avoid. Lucy looked at him with understanding sadness. Even in her weakened state, she understood the weight Ethan carried. "I know what it's like, to lose someone and not know what happened. It's like a part of you dies with you." His words were soft, but they carried a depth that only those who had suffered so much could understand. Ethan leaned forward, his face in his hands, trying to choke back the tears that threatened to well up. He had always been strong, the kind of person others saw as a leader, someone who could be trusted. But here, in that moment, he felt as vulnerable as he had ever felt before. Everything he had, everything he knew, had been destroyed by the mountain. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not knowing if he was apologizing to Lucy, to Claire, or to himself. His emotions were running high, and he struggled to hold himself together. But then, something unexpected happened. Lucy, with the little strength she had left, placed her head on Ethan's shoulder, seeking some comfort. He was surprised, but accepted it. In that moment, human warmth, even though it was so scarce and fragile, was enough to remind him that he was not alone. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a spark of something other than pain. Maybe it was hope, or just the comfort of knowing that no matter how broken he was, he still had someone by his side. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. It was a simple word, but to Ethan, it meant the world. He hugged her gently, feeling the fragile rhythm of her breathing, and promised himself he wouldn't let her give up. Even if he had failed Claire, even if he didn't know what the future held, he still had a chance to save Lucy. Night was falling, and the darkness of the mountain was beginning to envelop them. But there, in that small opening in the rocks, something resisted. The connection they created, in the midst of despair and pain, was now their greatest weapon against the relentless emptiness of the mountain. Night fell with a terrifying silence, broken only by the sound of the wind sneaking through the crevices of the mountain. The dark brought an even greater feeling of helplessness, as if the world around them had disappeared, leaving only Ethan and Lucy trapped in their fight for survival. The freezing air burned their skin, and even the shelter between the rocks seemed insufficient to protect their already weakened bodies. Lucy was weak, almost without the strength to speak. His head still rested on Ethan's shoulder, and he felt the weight of responsibility increasing by the minute. The temperature was dropping quickly, and he knew they couldn't stay there much longer. They needed help, they needed a miracle, and fast. Ethan held Lucy tightly, his thoughts wavering between the brutal reality and the memories that continued to haunt him. He couldn't stop thinking about Claire. Her look, her laugh. Everything was recorded in his mind as if she were there, by his side. And in a way it was. The guilt of having lost her was a constant, a shadow that hung over him, making everything heavier, harder to bear. As Ethan fought his own demons, Lucy let out a weak moan, bringing him back to the present. "I'm so cold," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I know, but we're going to make it, Lucy. We just need to hold on a little longer," he replied, trying to keep his tone optimistic, even though he knew that the chances of survival were decreasing by the hour. He looked at the snow around him, trying to come up with a plan, but visibility was minimal, and fatigue made thinking difficult. What disturbed him most, however, was not the physical situation, but the emotions that consumed him. He felt torn between the desire to continue fighting and the temptation to simply give up. The world around seemed so vast, so indifferent. Why should he continue? What was there left for him, besides the pain? Lucy began to shake violently, and Ethan knew time was running out. He needed to stay warm and find a way to save them both, but at every moment, his own strength seemed to slip out of his control. The cold was winning, and he knew he couldn't rely on his willpower alone for much longer. "Lucy, can you stand?" he asked, trying to probe her condition. She tried to move, but her legs wouldn't obey. I don't know." His voice was a fragile whisper, and hopelessness began to show in every word. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to control his despair. He leaned forward, his mind racing with chaotic thoughts, and suddenly, a memory emerged with overwhelming force. He remembered Claire, at the beginning of that journey, when they were still planning the climb. She was always so full of life, always believing that everything would work out. Sometimes we just need to believe that the next step will be enough to carry us forward, Ethan. Don't think about the whole mountain, just the next step, she said, with that confident smile that seemed to brighten even the darkest days. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting that memory penetrate his being. Claire. She was still there, somehow guiding him. And then, a new determination came over him. He couldn't let everything end like this. Lucy needed him, and somehow he felt that Claire was also waiting for him to continue. Maybe there was nothing left to do for her, but for Lucy there was still hope. "I will carry you," he said, firmly. Lucy looked at him with wide eyes, but without the strength to protest. "We have no choice. We need to get out of here now." With a monumental effort, Ethan stood up, placing Lucy's arm around his shoulders. He felt her body wince in pain, but she didn't say anything. She was so weak that she seemed to have accepted the need to depend completely on him. And despite all his doubts, Ethan knew that was the only choice they had. The path through the snow was treacherous. With each step, her feet sank, and Lucy's weight made everything even more difficult. But at the same time, he felt a new strength growing within him. With every step he took, Claire's advice echoed in his mind. Don't think about the whole mountain, just the next step. Ethan knew he couldn't see the top, nor the final solution. But at that moment, the important thing was to move forward, one step at a time. For Lucy, for Claire, and in a way, for himself. There was something stronger than pain, something he still couldn't name, but that kept him going. The darkness of the night seemed to tighten around them, but in the midst of that pitch, Ethan found a small light, a flame that he thought had gone out with Claire, but that, surprisingly, was still burning. The will to survive. The snow fell thicker and thicker, covering the surrounding world in a silent layer, as if trying to swallow everything that was left. Ethan could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but he kept moving forward, step after step, carrying Lucy. His body ached everywhere, his muscles tense from so much effort, and the cold bit his skin as if it were trying to reach his bones. But no matter how much pain he felt in every fiber of his being, he didn't stop. Stopping would mean the end. Lucy was practically motionless in his arms, her face pale and her body so light she barely looked like she was alive. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, and Ethan knew that if they didn't find help soon, she would succumb to the cold. A silent fear began to form in her mind. Was he carrying her to her death? For a brief moment, the darkness that surrounded him seemed to extend into him. The feeling of despair tightened his chest, as if the weight of everything he had lost was crushing his soul. Claire, lost forever in the snow. Lucy, perhaps on her way to the same fate. He felt helpless, as if he were being dragged by a greater force, unable to change what fate had decided for him. But then, he remembered Claire's words. The next step, just the next step. His feet sank deeper into the snow with each movement, and the wind cut into his skin like sharp blades. He wanted to give up. He wanted to leave everything behind and simply surrender to the void. But he couldn't. Not now. Not after coming this far. Lucy mumbled something incoherent in his arms, and Ethan paused for a moment, trying to listen. Her voice was so weak he could barely make out the words. "I can't go on," she whispered, her head falling against his shoulder. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, trying to contain the pain he felt in his chest. He knew what she meant. I knew she was at her limit, but he also knew he couldn't let her give up. "Not now. You'll make it, Lucy," he said, his voice firm but charged with emotion. "I promise. Just a little more. Just one more step." He repeated these words to himself, like a prayer. One step, then another. He forced himself to keep going, even when his body was begging for rest. Finally, when all seemed lost, Ethan saw a light in the distance. His eyes took a while to process what they were seeing, as if his mind refused to believe that there could be anything beyond the snow and emptiness. It was a faint light, almost indistinct in the storm, but it was there, real. "Lucy, look," he said, his voice almost choked with emotion. "There is a light there. We achieved. We are close." He tried to move faster, but his body was at its limit. Each step felt like a superhuman effort, but the light ahead guided him like a beacon of hope. Lucy didn't respond. It was too weak, but Ethan felt a new energy rise within him, something he didn't know he still possessed. He forced himself to continue, each step a challenge, but now he had a destination, a chance. The light grew closer, and Ethan realized it was coming from a small cabin, almost hidden among the rocks. It was like a miracle, a last drop of hope in the middle of an ocean of despair. When he finally reached the door, he almost collapsed with relief. With what little strength he had left, he pounded on the wood, his weak fists pounding against the door in desperation. For a moment, there was no response. The fear that the cabin was empty hit him like a punch in the gut. But then, he heard footsteps on the other side. The door creaked open, revealing a man with a serious, aged expression. His eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation before him. "Please," Ethan mumbled, barely able to speak. "Help us." The man looked at Lucy, unconscious in Ethan's arms, and without saying a word, motioned for them to enter. Ethan, almost without strength, entered the cabin, feeling the warmth envelop him like a welcoming hug. He carefully placed Lucy on the ground, her body still shaking slightly. The man quickly sprang into action, grabbing blankets and wrapping them carefully. "She has hypothermia," he said, his voice deep but sure. "Let's see what we can do." Ethan sat next to Lucy, his entire body overcome with relief and exhaustion. He felt his strength finally leaving him, but for the first time in a long time, there was hope. The dim light from the cabin illuminated their faces, and for a moment, everything around them seemed calm. They still didn't know what awaited them beyond that cabin, but for now, they were alive, and that was enough. The heat of the cabin was a shock to Ethan's body, as if life was slowly being injected back into his veins. As he looked at Lucy, huddled under the blankets the man had provided, a profound relief washed over him. For the first time since the avalanche destroyed everything, there was a real sense of safety, that maybe they could survive. The man who had received them didn't say much, but his movements were precise and careful. He brought a bowl of hot soup and placed it next to Lucy, encouraging her to drink it little by little, helping her regain consciousness. His eyes, although tired and marked by time, conveyed a kind of wisdom and calm that contrasted with the chaos that Ethan had gone through so far. "You guys were lucky," the man said, with an accent Ethan couldn't identify. "Many don't survive that mountain, especially this time of year." Ethan nodded, still panting. His legs hurt, his whole body felt like it was on the verge of collapse, but he knew he couldn't afford to break down. "Not yet. I almost didn't make it." She was on edge. The man looked at Lucy and nodded slowly. "She still is. But now you have a chance." He then turned to Ethan, his gaze piercing. "And you too, boy. Do you think it was just luck that got you here?" Ethan didn't know how to respond. He had heard so many times that surviving the avalanche was a miracle, and now, getting to that cabin seemed like another. But the man's question seemed to carry something deeper, something Ethan wasn't ready to face. Lucy, her eyes still half closed, managed to mumble a few words of thanks, but most of her energy seemed focused on simply staying awake. Ethan watched her for a moment, with a mixture of relief and guilt. He had brought her here, but he couldn't help but think about Claire. Where would she be now? Lost forever in the mountain, swallowed by snow, forgotten by everyone except him. The man, sensing Ethan's inner conflict, sat down on a chair next to the fire and looked at him seriously. "The mountain has its own rules. She is not evil, but she is not pious either. Do you think you can overcome the mountain?" The question caught Ethan by surprise. He had never thought of it that way. Overcome the mountain? No, he never wanted to beat her. All he wanted was to save Claire, and then Lucy. But now, sitting there, next to this man who seemed to know the secrets of that hostile land, something began to stir within him. "I don't think it's possible to beat something so ruthless," Ethan replied, after a long pause. His voice was hoarse but firm. "I just wanted to survive and save the people I love." The man showed a small smile, as if he had expected this answer. "The mountain teaches us what we cannot control, boy, and it also teaches us what we can. You saved a life today. That's more than most people can achieve." The man's words were simple, but they hit Ethan like a hard truth. He had done what he could, but the guilt for Claire was still overwhelming. He looked away, unable to face the depth of his own pain. All he wanted was to bring her back, but he knew deep down that hope was dying. Lucy, now more conscious, tried to sit up with effort. Ethan quickly went over to her, helping her get straightened out. She looked at him with gratitude in her eyes, but also something more. "You saved my life, Ethan," she said, her voice still weak but full of sincerity. "Thanks." Ethan shook his head, trying to shake off the weight of his emotions. "I did what anyone would do." Lucy lightly squeezed his hand, a simple gesture, but full of meaning. "No, you did more than that. He didn't give up on me, even when I wanted to give up." Those words sank deep into Ethan, reviving Claire's memories. He had failed Claire, but not Lucy. The pain of losing someone he loved was still there, but maybe, somehow, he could carry that burden and move on. The man watched in silence, as if he understood the depth of that moment. Finally, he stood up and added more wood to the fireplace, the crackle of the fire filling the silence that had fallen between them. "You two need to rest," the man said bluntly. "The storm will last a while longer, but when it passes, I will help you get down the mountain." Ethan nodded, feeling relief flood his body. They weren't safe yet, but for the first time in a long time, he believed they could be. He lay on the floor of the cabin, feeling the warmth of the fire for the first time in days, and as sleep slowly overcame him, he thought about Claire. Maybe he would never find her. Perhaps, as the man said, the mountain had already decided its fate. But at that moment, he was alive, and Lucy was alive, and that, somehow, seemed to be enough for him to continue. The sound of the storm outside had died down when Ethan awoke, the heat of the fire still burning gently in the fireplace. The dim morning light filtered through the cabin's small window, creating an eerie feeling of calm. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that everything was fine, that the mountain had spared them, and that the journey to the end was near. But reality soon set in. They still had a long way to go. Lucy was lying next to him, breathing more steadily. Her face, although still pale, seemed more relaxed. The warmth and rest had brought some color back to her cheeks, and Ethan felt profound relief at seeing her recovering. He got up carefully, trying not to wake her, and walked to the window. The world outside was still white, but the wind had died down, and the snow was no longer falling with the same fury. There was a chance. The man, who had spent the night in a chair by the fireplace, stood up when he saw Ethan move. "The storm has calmed. We can start descending today," he said, in the same deep, calm voice. Ethan nodded, but something inside him hesitated. Going down the mountain meant leaving Claire behind once and for all. It meant accepting that he would never find her, that she had become part of that icy, desolate landscape. The man noticed the indecision in Ethan's eyes and, after a long silence, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes losing someone on the mountain is like losing a part of yourself," the man said, his voice soft but full of experience. "But living means carrying this loss and continuing to walk. Not for those you lost, but for those who are still here." The words sank deep into Ethan. He knew there was no choice. The mountain had taken Claire, and he could never get her back. But Lucy was alive, and he had promised himself he wouldn't let her die there. "I couldn't fail again." "You're right," Ethan finally replied, his voice low but determined. "We need to get down." They calmly prepared for the descent. The man, who seemed to know every corner of that mountain, would guide them along the safest path. Lucy, still weak, would need help, but she was already able to stand, albeit with difficulty. Time was now an ally, and Ethan knew that the descent wouldn't be as brutal as what they had faced so far. When they left the cabin, the cold hit them again, but not as relentlessly as before. The wind was just a chill breeze, and the snow, although thick, seemed to have stabilized. The road ahead was still long, but there was something different about Ethan. For the first time in days, he didn't feel the crushing weight of the mountain above him. There was pain, of course. The loss of Claire still suffocated him in ways he could barely express, but there was also acceptance. A silent acceptance that not all battles are won, but that surviving is, in itself, a victory. Lucy walked beside him, leaning on Ethan, her steps slow but steady. She didn't say much, but her presence, her simple breathing beside him, was a reminder that life, however fragile, went on. The man walked ahead, his footprints marking the path in the snow, and despite the silence between them, there was an unspoken communication. Everyone knew what was at stake. Hours passed, and the mountain, although still imposing, seemed less threatening. Every step down was a step toward freedom, a step closer to survival. Ethan's body felt tired, but there was a growing peace within him. He could still see Claire's face every time he closed his eyes, but now, what he saw was not just the guilt, but the memories. The good memories. The moments they shared before everything was taken from him. As they walked, Lucy finally broke the silence. "Do you think that someday, this pain will go away?" His voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything they had faced. Ethan looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. He knew he didn't have a simple answer for this. "I knew that the pain of losing someone never really went away, but I also knew that time brought acceptance. I don't think the pain ever goes away," he replied, honestly. "But over time, it transforms. And one day, the good memories become stronger than the pain." Lucy nodded, and a slight smile appeared on her face, as if those words brought her some comfort. Ethan smiled back, feeling something new inside him. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the certainty that, as much as the mountain had taken something from him, it had also taught him something valuable: the importance of continuing. When they finally reached the base of the mountain, the relief was almost palpable. The valley stretched out before them, and in the distance, Ethan could see the road that would lead back to civilization. He paused for a moment, looking back at the mountain that now seemed just a distant shadow. "Let's move on," he said, more to himself than to the others. And then, with Lucy by his side, he took his first step back into the world, leaving the mountain behind but carrying with him everything she had taught him.
If this story captured and moved you, don't forget to like the video, share with those who love intense stories like this, and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing more narratives that will surprise you and stir your emotions. Don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey.